Hi, today we're discussing property management. When someone owns a property, they have the ability to use that property for several different purchases. One of the things that they can do, that an owner can do with their property, is actually allow someone else to use the property for their own personal interest. That's what we would see generally in the area of an investment property, where the owner of the property would be considered a landlord and the person using the property or renting the property would be considered as a tenant. So generally, there's a platform that's used for that area, and it's in that area, and it would be the property management platform, where sometimes there's a third party that acts on behalf of the landlord to use the property. In that case, the tenant would use that property as a leasehold estate. And in order for that to happen, there are certain minimum requirements that would need to be met. As those requirements are met, the owner itself, which is the landlord, would use a property management team or the broker as their property manager to handle the day-to-day operations for that to happen. So when it comes to a leasehold estate, all right, the leasehold estate represent the rights and interests of the tenant as they're using the landlord's property, okay? They can use that property as an estate for years, where in an estate for years, they have the possession of that property for a certain period of time. They can also use that property as an estate from period to period. That's an agreement where the tenant can use the property from year to year, month to month, week to week. That would be considered your quote unquote, the rental agreement that a tenant has with the landlord. Then also we have the estate at will. And the estate at will, the determinant of the estate at will, the word at will, that means that the tenant or the landlord can terminate that agreement at will. And lastly, we have an estate of sufferance. And the estate of sufferance comes when the requirements or the requirements of the lease has been met. That means that the time frame has been met. The tenant has been in the property for that certain period of time, and they've passed that time and they're continuing to use their property. They're using the estate as sufferance. If the tenant decides to stay in a property and to make payments, then what would happen is that it would revert to basically month to month, day to day, week to week, however it goes, where it would be a rental agreement. Now, the minimum requirements for a lease. Now, when it comes to the minimum requirement for a lease, when a landlord intends to rent a property, they basically have to create a lease agreement. Now, that lease agreement can be written in verbal. But if it's written in, well, let's say in any case, it can be written, like we were saying, it's written or verbal. There's certain minimum requirements that have to be met if it's written in verbal. And those requirements is abbreviated as land, where L would represent the length of duration of the lease. A of land would represent the amount of rent. N would represent the names of the parties, and D would represent the description of the properties. Now, in the case of these minimum requirements, if the lease is for more than 1 year, then that agreement has to be done in writing. Now, when it comes to property management, okay, property owners, they hire licensed real estate brokers to handle and oversee the day-to-day operations in their rental or commercial properties, okay? They usually enter into what we call a property management agreement, okay? And in that property management agreement, the broker is the one that the broker or agent would handle the day-to-day operations or the interactions with the tenant, okay? Now, if that property is more than 16 units, then there would have to be a resident manager that has to be on the property to actually deal with the day-to-day activities and the interactions with the tenant, okay? Now, in this case, the resident manager is not required to have a license. So as we look at this, licensed real estate agents and brokers, they assist, okay? They assist the landlord in their relationship with the tenant to handle the day-to-day activities. And we know that when it comes to large 16 units, for properties that are more than 16 units, they have to have a resident manager. But one of the things that we have to also understand is that there are certain minimum requirements that have to be made, which are the land requirements. Okay. In this case, the resident manager would handle the day-to-day operations, but that's for the 16 units, the properties that are more than 16 units. But in any other area, the property management team or the property manager, the owned by the broker, would be the one that would handle the day-to-day operations. And all that's how we would explain certain areas of property management.